In today's video, I'm going to be painting the Shakush Light Armored Unit, the newest tag from Haqqislam. And while painting the model, I'm also going to show you how I messed up the plan that I had for it, and then how I managed to mostly write it in the end. When you watch YouTube videos, I guess you, just like me, also get the impression that YouTubers always get it right at the first time, but that's probably not true. At least it's definitely not true for me. So let's see what I messed up and how I managed to overcome it, and maybe you will be able to learn from my mistakes, or just understand that it's completely fine to make them. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures. When I started painting this model, I had this video in my head that I wanted to do about it. I had everything planned out, I had all the paints in my head, all the steps in my head, and I just wanted to make a guide that's gonna be easy to follow and easy to film at the same time. But like with most plans, when it gets in contact with the enemy, it didn't really survive, so then I had to improvise. And after a while, it became obvious that this video is not gonna be about the initial topic that I envisioned, but maybe it can be a video about my painting process, how I go back and forth, make mistakes, and then somehow end up with a result that might not be exactly what I was looking for, but I'm still pretty happy with. So let's see what I did, and I'll try to highlight all the points where I had to make changes or something didn't go exactly according to plan. I wanted to start with an easy step, and here I actually succeeded. I just blocked in everything that wasn't supposed to be armor with black. But as soon as I started blocking in the armor colors, I started to have issues. Well, not from the beginning, because blocking in the armor colors was relatively easy. I had the zenithal highlight, I had a good coverage from the paint, so I just took a big brush and relatively thick paint and then just applied it with 1 or 2 thick coats. And yes, you heard right, thick coats, not thin coats, because thin coats would mean that I would have to apply like 5 of them. The problem was not applying the paint, the problem was how the paint looked once it was applied. Because in my initial genius plan for this video, what I had in mind is a shadow color for all the armor panels and not a mid-tone. So the plan was that I would start with the darkest color on the panel, and then I work my way up from the darkest to the highest highlight. And I had everything figured out. I knew exactly what kind of paints I'm going to use after this one. The problem is that this was just not dark enough. And I guess the reason for that is that I used the zenithal highlight. And the reason why I was using the zenithal highlight is because I thought that I needed something brighter for this model, because I was just afraid that if I start from black, then the whole thing would look more desaturated, more dark than it's on the box art, and I wanted to go for something like that. But it's not the end of the world, right? It's not that bright. It actually is still quite dark once it's dry, so I can work with that. It's just a couple of extra steps. It's annoying, but that's fine. But then I got to the other kind of color on the armor, which is this like tan or middle stone kind of color. And I really had, once again, the paints figured out. Remember, like I had the plan for the video and I really wanted to go through with it. I already deviated from it a little bit with the other color, so this had to work. So I just started to do it. And I'm sure that you guys can already see that this is not exactly a shadow color, or if it is, then this is going to be a very low contrast mini. And I guess I saw that too. I just wanted to really stick with the plan because I didn't want to disrupt the video and the flow that I had in mind. So I was thinking maybe it's just going to be darker when it's dry, but it wasn't. And as an end result, what I ended up with is not 2 shadow colors on the armor, but more like 2 midtones on the armor that still required both highlights as well as shadows. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly valid way of doing things. It's just not the way I wanted to do it here. At this point, I wanted to do the sword because at least something has to go according to plan, right? But of course it didn't. So please remember how this looks right now. And then once we are at the end of the video, you will see that the sword will look nothing like this. I guess at least I put some color on it. And while we are doing something else, this doesn't look like it's unpainted. Okay, here is something that actually worked out quite well. I managed to find a good color, this orange-brown, for all the accents of the armor, all these extra elements and the freehand. Although, of course, this is also a mid-tone, because at this point I already realized that this is what I'm doing, so I already started making modifications to the plan and leaned into it. And sometimes this mindset of screw it, it's already messed up anyway, actually helps you. And this is what I did here with the freehand, because usually for a freehand you would really take your time, you would really think it through, and I wasn't doing any of that. I was like, this is ruined anyway, let's just do it. I mean, I wasn't completely crazy about this. I still had a plan of how to do it. The idea was that I can just use the previous color because there's only a single color on the mini to then correct the mistakes. If you do something like airbrushing the color or something like that, or you have multiple shades on it already, it's really difficult to correct mistakes, because then even the color that you use to correct the mistake is going to be different from the original base coat. But here, both of the colors were just a single color. It was just a base coat on all the panels, and both of them covered quite well, so I felt quite safe. I think we tend to be too afraid of freehands, especially simple ones like this, because what can you really do wrong? Like, everything can be corrected, and that was my mindset here. I don't care, I will do really thick lines, I will make mistakes, and I'll just rely on the other paints, the base coats, to then correct them. The end result might look a little bit rough, but that's okay, because for now we just want to have the general shapes in place, and then there is time later on to make changes. Okay, so I had everything covered, but unfortunately it didn't look the way I intended at this stage. So the question was, how do I fix that? First of all, I applied some black lining on the whole model, because I was operating with midtones mostly rather than the shadows that I intended, so the model was lacking all the deep shadows between the panels. And once I was done with this, well, the easy solution for me to apply both shadows and highlights in a relatively fast and easy way was the airbrush. And at this stage, I was completely throwing the whole plan out of the window, because in the initial plan, there was no airbrushing involved at all. I just wanted to go from shadows to highlights and maybe do a little bit of smoothing with the airbrush, but that's it. And the airbrushing stage was quite easy, because all I needed to do was to highlight all the panels in both the colors. And some of you might be thinking, oh god, that's super difficult, right, to do this with an airbrush on an already kind of painted model. But if you think about it, this is just base coats, which we are modifying with the airbrush, so that's easy. The freehands are just sketches. We are going to have to redo them and strengthen them later on anyway. And if there is a little bit of color transition on them, maybe that's actually a good thing. And the black lines that I did are going to be reinforced later on anyway. I was using super thin down paint, so that meant that even if I sprayed it somewhere where it wasn't supposed to go, it's not like it's going to show up too much. It's just going to be a slight discoloration of the panel, which might actually be even a good thing. The problem was that I guess I was in this mindset of already not going according to plan, and nothing is working, and I'm just doing this kind of without a plan. I'm just rushing into it. And I created way more imperfections and spiders and overall problems on the panel than I would usually do. I just made a lot of mistakes. But after this highlighting stage, honestly, I felt like nothing is going the way I want. I am making mistakes. This whole thing looks bad, and this video is not going to happen. But even if the video doesn't happen, at least I wanted to complete the model and make it look relatively good, so I was soldiering on. But fortunately, this was also somehow the tipping point, I suppose, where I just accepted my fate and started to just concentrate on the model rather than on what I wanted to do with it. Because as soon as I applied some whole red from below as a shadow color, the whole thing started to come together a little bit. Of course, it didn't have any of the highlights yet, so the overall contrast on the model wasn't there yet, but at least there was already some contrast between the highlights that I applied, even though they looked bad, and then the shadows. So it started to look like, okay, this can maybe go somewhere. And this gave me enough of a confidence to go into the edge highlighting process, which is a super laborious thing on a model like this, because it has a ton of edges. And this is the stage where the model starts to look good, because you finally start creating contrast, and because the different panels now start to be distinct from each other and you can differentiate them from each other. You will be actually able to see whether the model will look good in the end or not after the first, let's say, 2 rounds of edge highlights. And the process itself was fairly standard with the edge highlights. I was just using my usual principles, let's say, when I'm doing edge highlights. And you really have to pay attention to this, because it's easy to fall into either one or the other extreme. The one extreme being that you don't edge highlight everything. You try to do a lazy job, let's say, and you just edge highlight the things that are very visible. The other extreme being that you edge highlight everything with every color. Your goal should be that you should highlight every edge at least once. So your first edge highlight color should go on every single edge. The second one should only go on, let's say, 80% of the model. So here you can already not edge highlight some of the things that are completely in shadow. And all your subsequent colors, all the ones that you use after, let's say, the second one, should only go on less and less of a surface on the model, making sure that you only use the last ones on the most prominent edges, the most prominent parts of the model that you really want to be in focus. It might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but if you do too many edge highlights and you do them all across the model, then you are actually not going to have enough contrast. And here's another thing that I did wrong, and I ended up actually not liking it in the end, but I kept it because it would have been a lot of work to change it, and I was already committed. At this stage, it looked really like a good idea to add edge highlights to all the freehands. But instead of looking like edge highlights, they more like look part of the pattern, if that makes any sense. They also prevented me from doing the nice chipping effects that you see on the box art, and I think that was a mistake. That would have looked better, but you guys tell me, do you like these? Do you think it's fine, or is it more like to the detriment of the model? Speaking of chipping effects though, here's something that actually worked out the way I intended, because I already know how to do this. I did it on the previous model as well, the Maggie, and I just used a piece of foam that I tore off. It was actually, I think, from the same box that this came in. And then I dipped it into Rhinox hide, removed some of it on a paper towel, and then I started dipping it on the model. And this creates this chipping effect, like the paint is coming off, or it's blown, or like eroded away by the winds in the desert. And it also ties it nicely together with the Maggie. At this stage, I decided to stop with the edge highlights on the armor panels. This is definitely not the end. I'm going to go higher with them. But first, I wanted to see how the non-metallics and all the other elements of the model look before I finish the highlights. I leave you with a nice montage of how I did the non-metallics, because the overall principle is the same as I described about the normal edge highlighting as well. I just want to call your attention to two additional things. One, that the difference between these edge highlights and this surface, really, compared to, let's say, the green and the tan, is that it has to be brighter, which means that you have to go higher in your highlights. If you used, let's say, an ice yellow on the green as your final highlights, then the non-metallic final highlight should be higher than that. It should be an ivory or even a pure white. And the second thing is that you also have to create some noise on those panels. It's not enough if you just do edge highlights and leave everything else black. So if there is a large surface that doesn't have any features on it, then you should create those features. And the different big panels of the gun are actually perfect examples of this. Once I was done with the non-metallics, I felt like the model is really coming together, and that gave me this nice starting point, or like more like a finishing point actually, of where my ceiling is with the brightness of the model. Which means that now I know that I used ivory as the highest color for the non-metallics. Maybe I should have gone for pure white. I had to go lower in the brightness for all the other panels so that they don't look non-metallic, or at least not as much as the actual metals. It might sound funny, but in the end, every surface is non-metallic. It just depends on how glossy, satin or matte you are painting it, how high you are going to go with your highlights. This is probably the coolest part of the painting process because you are almost done. You are in the final stretch and you also already know what you are doing. My original plan might have completely went to, the trash can, but now I had a new one and I already knew where I was going. So I felt like, okay, this actually might be something in the end. And once I was happy with the overall state of the model, I had to fix that sword, because you might have seen throughout the painting process that there were multiple iterations of how it looked. I added a couple of scratches here and there, I repainted the colors, and I just had no clue what to do with it. But I had a plan for at least how to do it. I knew that the only way to fix it is to use an airbrush, but of course the sword is right in front of the model, so how are you going to use an airbrush for that? And yeah, sure, you can use like putties and different kind of products to achieve this and completely mask the model, but why do you need something so complicated when all you need is to cover everything behind it? So I used tinfoil. In the end, I kept some of the original ideas of having these two tones and the scratches and everything, and I just decided to paint over it with the airbrush and use a similar glow effect that you see on the box art because, well, I didn't have a better idea than this. Originally I had some for some cool reflections on the bottom of the blade, but then I just kind of abandoned them when I realized that this whole model is just not going the way I intended. Once I was done with the airbrushing step, all it needed was, well, you guessed it, edge highlights. And the end result looks like this. I ended up using a way more roundabout way to get here than what I intended, but in the end, I guess the result is what matters, and I quite like it. It's not exactly how I imagined it, and there are a couple of elements on it that I would definitely change if I did it again, but in the end, I think it's cool. I hope you guys enjoyed watching the video and maybe learned something from it. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and see you in the next one.